So thank you very much, Alana. And I know you have written a lot of things in your books about your career, about how you approached verbatim theatre. But we really want to have you saying it now. So the first question I want to ask is, when and how did you first come in contact with verbatim theatre or documentary theatre?
Yeah, I first came into contact with verbatim theatre in about 2004 when I was thinking of writing a play about a local football team called the South Sydney Rabbitohs, and there was at the time this push for sport to be kind of globalised. Yeah, This is the play. It was pay TV were kind of wanting all the Sydney teams, all the football teams, to amalgamate so that pay TV could have teams in New Zealand and in other states of Australia. So rugby league had come out of New South Wales. And a lot of the traditional teams were really resentful of that. They didn't like that. And so one team, Souths, who I had grown up being a supporter of, my family, they decided to take on Rupert Murdoch, basically. And they took Super League to the NRL to court, the National Rugby League it was, and they won eventually, but not before something like 80,000 people were in the streets supporting them, saying they shouldn't have to amalgamate. So I basically just interviewed all the players, all the people who had been part of the protest. And funnily enough, it's not a play at all hardly about football. It's about the conflict between tradition and modernity. Like, where's the line? What do we value and what don't we? And, you know, every great play, even a verbatim play, has a premise that can't be answered. And so I like that, because you can't answer what's the value of tradition, what's the value of, you know, contemporary modernity. It's an unsolvable question, which means that it's going to make a great play. So I started to become very interested. What I was really interested in, I can tell you, was the fact that a lot of the people I were meeting were very lucid about why they were part of this fight, and they were sort of working class revolutionaries. They talked a lot about the big end of town telling them what to do and not telling them what to do, and they talked about the fact that they didn't have anything other than football, and that they wanted to fight for that because they were poor, and that was they were convicted about wanting to support that. And I was also really interested in the people who were no longer poor and no longer even living in South Sydney, but had this kind of childhood commitment to them as a team. And it was really interesting, because I felt I had to make it verbatim, because a lot of Australians think that sports fans are sort of, for want of a better word, a little bit inarticulate and maybe even sort of stupid. And so I needed to have their exact words so that I could kind of prove that they were these lucid working class philosophers. Because if I'd made it up, people would say, "Oh, Alana, you know, you've shown them in a very flattering light." But my experience was that they're not inarticulate. They don't have half-finished sentences. They can express themselves really well. So it was really amazing. That was my first verbatim play, and I call this sort of pure verbatim, because it's literally from transcripts, and they say and and yeah, that was the beginning.
So, but this kind of form, verbatim theatre form, so was it popular in Australia? How did you? Well, I don't understand the rationale behind using verbatim then, but why did you take up this form apart from that rationale? So, I mean, was verbatim theatre popular in Australia, or, yeah, why?
I had been working as a playwright for some time at that stage, and my very first play was about a teenage alcoholic. So I think I'd always been very interested in in interviews and personal stories. I had worked myself as a radio drama maker and a radio feature maker. So I'd done a lot of training as an interviewer, and I was very interested in historical subjects. And because I was a playwright, I was going to the theatre a lot. So I had seen, oh, that must be one of yours. Because I was going to the theatre a lot, I had seen that Paul Brown had done Aftershocks, and so I knew that. I'd also was a big admirer at that time of David Hare. And I knew the sort of work he was doing. And so I think that I had conceived of other new plays, but I felt that to tell this story, like, I think that these days you should reach for verbatim when you can't tell the story in any other way than using transcripts. And the way I would put it is that I had seen this form, but I'd never had an idea or an impulse to write a play that I absolutely needed to hear from the real people and use their actual words. So it had been floating around as an idea. I had, like I say, I'd seen Aftershocks, which I absolutely loved. And it was really just that the story moved me to want to tell it in this way.
And so after this one, you continue to work on verbatim theatre, and after so many years, 2004, so after more than 15 years, is there any changes in the way you approach verbatim theatre?
Yeah, I think I've talked now about the fact that I see my work on a sort of like a spectrum, you know, like which at one end is pure verbatim, where you would use transcripts for some reason because you had to have the absolute authority of that. So yeah, that's one end. And then the other end is sort of pure drama, where you absolutely make it up. But even that, I feel like all of my work is very heavily researched, and so it would never be like it's just coming out of my head, as it were. So, you know, and then I feel, to answer your question, that some of my work is in the middle and slides along that scale. So the play I did recently about Lindy Creighton is based on boxes that I looked in the National Library. They've got 199 boxes of letters to this woman who her baby was taken by a dingo in 1980. It's a very famous Australian case, one of the grossest miscarriages of justice in this country. And there was a kind of national lynch situation. It was almost like Australia turned into a lynch mob against this woman. There's a line in the play where it says, Australia, three things have divided Australia right down the centre: conscription, Whitlam and Lindy Chamberlain. She went to jail for 3.5 years and 20,000 people wrote letters to her. So I went and got the actual transcripts of the letters, and then I interviewed her, and the central part of the play is this monologue that's in Lindy's absolute own words. So again, for me, it was this thing of, we've heard other people talk about her. This has authority because it's her actual words. And so again, I wanted to use the real archived letters, and then the real verbatim transcript. So yeah, I mean, but there's other plays of mine that I've done recently. The Sugar House, which was on at Belvoir this year, which is a, you know, classic family drama, 3 generations, and it's based a lot on my own personal history, actually. And I did involve the Piedmont Historical Society, and I did do a lot of work, but technically it's not a verbatim play.
And so, when did you decide to use verbatim? Is it in the very beginning when you start the project, when you have a subject matter, then you decide to use verbatim, or after you collect all the materials and you think that it's better to use verbatim? Or this kind of materials you've got, it's better to use pure drama. So when did you make that decision?
Yeah, I think that's at the premise stage. I think that all dramatists have to work with a premise, by which I mean a question, what would happen if, or the premise of your investigations, and that's when I decide whether it's going to be a verbatim play or more of a drama. I mean, I actually think, I passionately think that they're the same in many ways in terms of having to show conflict within characters. You know, I don't think you can ever have people in verbatim plays just say what they think, which is a myth about verbatim. I still think you have to see people on the horns of a dilemma and we're understanding things about them. So I think all the things that are good in a traditional drama are also good in a verbatim play. So yeah, I mean, I think that my answer to your question is that I really believe that it's about what you're trying to investigate. And as I've explained in a couple of instances, for me, there's times where only the authenticity of the real record works. When I wrote my book called Bowerbird, I was encouraged by the editor. I can probably hold it up. I was encouraged by the editor, Victoria Chance, to come up with a new term, which I call close work theatre. So I say that a lot of my work is close work, meaning that I work really closely with communities, but it's not always verbatim. So it's kind of not always transcript based, but I always work very close to the community of interest. And one of the tenets of my verbatim work is that the community of interest are always part of the presentation. So inevitably on the opening night, there will be community members there and people who I've interviewed there. And I like to keep them really close. I think that would be one of the things that I would define my work as being, yeah.
So what is, to me, after my experience of doing documentary theatre, it was really exhausting because you face such a large amount of materials, and but of course it gave me a lot of pleasure and joy and satisfaction. So what makes you, what's the reason why you still use this kind of approach to theatre if it is so exhausting? And yeah.
Well, I agree with you. I've actually made a joke sometimes when I talk. I say it would be a lot easier to sit at your desk and make it up, you know, like it really would. Look, there's so many reasons. The first is that real people are infinitely more interesting than anything I can make up in my head in some ways. I mean, real people are so surprising and contradictory, and they're so, you know, all the rules we put around people saying that they're one thing or one identity, you never get that in real life. In real life, people are so multiple and they're so porous, you know, they're so able to be influenced by so many things. So I love that. I love that it brings in communities to the theatre. One of the things I love about verbatim is that it creates this audience cocktail, which I really love, where the story that you're writing spills through the fourth wall into the audience. So I can give lots of examples, but the best one is a play of mine called Parramatta Girls, which I think you've got. Yeah, that's why you've got all of them there. Parramatta Girls, which is about women in Australia, a bit like the Magdalen homes that were in Ireland. They were put into state-run homes because they were considered uncontrollable. And it was often because they'd run off with boyfriends or they got pregnant. And when women came along to this play, they would often shout at the actors on stage, you know, like encouragement, or suddenly they made their presence felt. And I just love that. I love that sense that people might be sitting next to someone who this story is actually about. So that's a second reason. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that artists do that show ugly truths about our histories, and verbatim documentary theatre is a unique way to kind of to remind people that these things happened. And I think it's our job as artists to uncover the things in history that people are too uncomfortable or don't think are important enough to talk about anymore. I think there are a lot of ugly truths in Australia that documentary theatre just gives us the most vivid access to. So they're the sort of big three. I mean, really, I could rave endlessly about verbatim. It is just, because it's just such a, it just does everything. You can be funny because real people are so funny, but you can also be incredibly you can get an audience involved in a way that almost no other theatre does, because I think it reaches into what theatre sometimes does is go, there's a screen between us and the play. You know, we have to empathetically involve ourselves in, you know, Elizabethan England or something. It's the same, we're the same human nature, but it's a different time. What documentary theatre does, sometimes very uncomfortably, is say, this is about you. This is about your life. This is about the person sitting next to you, and you can't hide from that. And I just love that. You know, I love that discomfort, but I also think that by putting real people's stories on stage, you say your life's important, and the decisions you make and the way you live in community is important. You know, the play you've just told me about, 1967, just sounds like, you know, what it's done is said to these people, this is really what happened in history. Like, not pretend. Like, these people really had to stand up for what they thought. And what kind of courage does that take? That's the person next to you. And you know, without, again, like becoming sort of hyperbolic about it, I think that what that does is make me believe that my life is important. You know, in the end, that's what artists do to all of us, isn't it? Artists say how you live your life and the decisions you make are important. And here's a great example of that in documentary theatre.
So the works after the Run Rabbit Rant, and I can see you interviewed the girls, the old woman now. So the girls, yeah. But you use an approach is like with singing, with songs, and it's kind of dramatize the things. Is why you take this approach?
So I interviewed about 30 or 35 women, and there was also at the time a big Senate inquiry into what's called the Forgotten Australians. They're called the Forgotten Australians. And what happened was, I said to Belvoir, we need to have a public showing of this play, because these are women. I said to them, why have you never talked about this? And they said, we were told we wouldn't be believed. Like, they were 14-year-olds, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. They were the ages of the girls who went in there. And they said, we were told we were bad girls and we wouldn't be believed. And so we've never spoken about it, which was also really hard for me to understand. So I said to the theatre company, we need to just put pure transcript on stage. These women, they think they haven't been believed, so we need to put it on stage. So I put on stage these 30 voices, and what I invited a lot of the women who I'd spoken to come along, and what the audience started to do is, because the brain can only hold, in a way, so many stories, and some of the stories started to seem quite similar, they sort of conflated them. You know, they started to put them together and after that reading, I said to the women, look, I'm going to collapse all of your stories into 8, because some of them have got quite similar sort of trajectories. And I spoke with Neil Armfield, who was the artistic director at the time, and he talked about, like I'd also talked about, maybe bringing in other characters like the guards at the home, or all of that. And he said, no, look, we really are only interested in the women because it's their story. We want to follow them. So I conceived this idea, because Belvoir Street's the home of great performance. So you get the most amazing actors, and I conceived a version where they could play both the 14-year-old selves who'd been put in the home, and plus the sort of 60-year-old or 70-year-old that they are now. And so you got that performative element, you know, you got that expertise of playing it. And so what that did was just liberate it into these 8 stories, and that's when I call it massaged verbatim, because the women were extremely funny. And you know, you may have had this experience, people who've been through incredible hardship are also often the funniest people you'll meet, and they'll often break into, like, they'll be laughing and laughing, and then they'll tell you some abominable story, something like that. You're crying and they're crying, and then the next minute it's very Brechtian. It's right, and it's kind of like it's so I wanted to honour the spirit of who they were, not just the exact words of who they were, and I couldn't always get the humour of these women simply by using their transcripts. Sometimes you can, but other times you need to sort of actually work as a dramatist in the way timing works and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, so I called it massaged, and I think that my contract with the audience was, this absolutely happened. I have interviewed these 35 women, but we are going to follow them as 8 characters. Yeah.
So thank you. So I see you continue with Eyes to the Floor, which is about the hay, and it's sort of a similar situation with that. But I see this style is, not the style, the way that it presented is kind of different, very much different from Parramatta Girls, because there's no really that brutal scenes or that talks about sex or whatever, but it gives a very intense tension to me, because it's very different to the Parramatta Girls. Yeah, yes, it's a more subtle way, but it's really traumatic, actually. It's more traumatic. So how did you take this?
Yeah, so when I was, thank you. You've picked it exactly. So when I was working on Parramatta Girls, all these women started telling me these horror stories of this place called Hay Girls' Home. And it was when the women at Parramatta rioted, and the 10 worst girls, or the girls climbed up on the roof, and they started taking the roof tiles off the roof and throwing them down onto the superintendent and all of this. So they got locked in this place that had been closed down. It was a men's jail out at Hay, which is in Western New South Wales, 10 of them. And they were locked in this jail that had been closed because it was considered too brutal for the men. And they were asked, like at Guantanamo Bay, they had to keep their eyes to the ground all 24 hours a day. I interviewed women who said that they'd been there, but they didn't know who else was there with them. It was just barbaric, absolutely barbaric. And to be honest, I thought, how am I going to get this into the Parramatta Girls play? Because I didn't know how I was going to do it. And what happened was Bonnie Durick, who is part of the Para Girls support group, said to me that she'd been approached by a youth theatre company in Hay, and that they wanted to commission Eyes to the Floor. And I was overjoyed. Because I knew that Parramatta Girls, as I said, was commissioned for Belvoir, I needed to factor in the ability of great actors, as I say, to do this kind of changing from 14 to 60, that's part of the theatrical conceit of the play. Whereas with a youth theatre company, I knew that you weren't going to get this virtuoso acting. You weren't going to get, as real great, but what you had was the authenticity of a real 14-year-old, a real 15-year-old, 16-year-old, 17-year-old. So what happens in Eyes to the Floor is they'll do things like the women weren't allowed to go to the toilet sometimes. That would be a form of torture that the guards would use. So the girls would have to hang on. So instead of having, a great actor do an amazing monologue about that, what I did was I would use, like you do in youth theatre, use a group scene to show that. So I had a girl standing at the end with a glass, an empty glass, and another at the other end of a row of girls, a girl with a jug. And they just kept pouring, and each of them was holding a glass, and they poured it from glass to glass until they kept pouring it into the glass at the end, which started to overflow as she talked about how she wanted to go to the toilet and wasn't allowed to. So it was a way of dramatising it without kind of having this virtuoso acting. I mean, they were good actors, I'm not saying that, it's just not the same as a professional. And I would also, there's a lot of scenes in that play where the girls talk about, like there's one girl's got a little pet moth that it's dead, but and it was just the beauty of them being a child with a little pet moth that was dramatised the barbarous treatment of these kids. And so I had to approach them really differently because I knew they were being performed by different companies, but they were both documentary. They're both absolutely about the play, but they have a different sway. I mean, in Parramatta Girls, there is a scene where she's cutting herself because, that's self-harm. Well, I didn't want to put that into a youth theatre play, but I just used other tactics. So I often talk with playwrights about thinking about, well, who's going to perform this work? You know, it's not just telling the story in a documentary style, but who's going to, you know, be the bodies. And so what don't you need to do in the writing? You know, it's a really interesting, I loved working with the youth theatre company on that play, yeah.
Ouvroir, and so you really need to pick one that you are most satisfied with. Is there anyone you are most satisfied with?
Oh, look, I think that the last play you do is always the one that you think is the best. I think every artist is like that. I just did a play, which hasn't been published, at the Seymour Centre in Sydney called Ear to the Edge of Time. And it's really precious to me because I travelled around the world interviewing radio astronomers, and it won a big international award called the Stage Award in 2012. But I couldn't get it onto a stage in Australia. I couldn't, like, getting plays about science on stage in Australia. And it was also, at that time, it was about gender politics. It was about women in science and the kinds of how, you know, when you actually talk to women working in these difficult kind of careers, they're not U-Butte sort of, you know, heroes. They're actually quite conflicted and difficult characters, and they can be slippery about how they they can be conflicted about how they approach being a woman in those situations. So at the moment, Ear to the Edge of Time is my favourite. But yeah, look, the Parramatta Girls is right up there. Yeah, because I felt like they announced Australia, the Parliament, Julia Gillard, several years ago announced a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And on that day I wrote to Wesley Enoch, who was the director of Parramatta Girls, and I said, I think we can be proud to be theatre makers today. Not that in any way we made that happen. I mean, there's lots of groups who've been trying to get that to happen for years, but we were just a small part of a growing voice to say this is wrong and we need to address this. So yeah.
Yeah, sometimes people will ask me, like in Hong Kong, a lot of the times I was question put to me that why do you use documentary theatre? There are so many documentary films, there are so many documentary TVs. Why would you use documentary theatre? Yeah, documentary films, then I can see the real person, the original interviewees on films. So why should you use documentary theatre? Yeah, how will you answer that question?
Oh yes, I did a lecture on Monday night called The Myth of the General Audience, and I talked about that for me, some things we did as a culture to some. So for instance, I can use the Lindy play. We did that as a culture to her. And so I believe that we then need to get together as a group and let go of that shame, let go of that pain, put it to rest. I don't believe that sitting individually in your room and knowing the story is enough. I actually think that theatre remains one of the great social acts of social cohesion. Like that we have, in this lecture, I argue that we have an identity that is beyond our individuality, that we have an identity that is local to where we live, but also, you know, it can be to our country or to many things, other sorts of identities, and that uniquely coming together in a theatre allows us to experience both the self as an individual and as a group. And you hear other people's reaction, you hear people laugh, you hear people's pain, you see people crying. That is very different to watching a film, even in a cinema. I think it's, and then, you know, when people come onto the stage at the end, you stand up and you say, you know, there are people in the audience who have been part of this. There's nothing like that. There's nothing like it. I don't think film can match that. I don't think it can. We think of that as the great art form. I still think that theatre retains its unique ability to do that. Yeah.
Well, I totally agree with that. Yeah, and it seems that your subject matters are so diverse, like the one you you just did about science, about gender politics, and you said you are going to do one about the big body, this kind of issue. And how did all these subject matters come to you? And is there a pattern for you to look for subject matters, or just pop the subject matters come up in your mind?
I mean, people have talked to me about this idea of like both the conflict between change and tradition is a theme. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because a couple of my plays are on the higher school certificate syllabus, and I always think it's students want you to ask you what are you writing about, and I think, well, I don't know, you have to decide that. But yeah, the conflict between change and tradition and change is one. I think that I'm always interested in subjects where, like I say, where there's not an answer. For me, that's so even though the subjects seem different, I think the question I'm asking is often the same, which is, like why are these people in conflict, both internally and with their culture? I don't know. I mean, why are we're artists because we don't understand the world unless we see it on a stage. We do it compulsively because we actually just can't get our bearings unless we see something on a public stage. That's all of us, people who go to the theatre and people who make it. And so I've just got this infinite curiosity about the world, but I need to sort of have it crushed down into like 90 minutes on stage. I suppose I've been very interested in not myself. I've been, unlike most artists, I know a lot of artists aren't like that, but I have got a real interest in other people as much as, and I think documentary theatre makers are like that they, that saying that no actor is so much themselves as when they're being someone else. I think that writers, especially documentary theatre makers, are like that. I think that we're never so much ourselves as when we're telling the story of someone else. I don't quite understand it myself, but it's something to do with that we know ourselves by empathising with the other. Something around that.
Yes, and I want to talk about the process of making, of writing a documentary theatre work, because, again, to me, it's always a joy to talk to people right now, but it gives me a quick headache when I have to face such a large amount of materials, and I have to, as you said, to crush down into a 90-minute work. Then, So, is there any strategy that you would use when you, in terms of how to edit all these materials into a performable, a theatrical text? Is there any strategy that you use?
Yes, and I go back to that thing I said about the premise, because I think that documentary theatre needs to investigate a question in the same way as any other play. And I think that the mistake people make about documentary theatre is that it's about the subject. Now, usually a lot of the stories we tell are stories that are already on the public record. The Souths had already won. We knew that they were back in. Why tell this as a play? And it was to ask certain questions about what it is like to be part of a tradition, and when do you throw that out? So it was character questions. It was questions that you could only answer by seeing it over 2 hours played out in front of you. I think that there's a danger in just telling the subject. And I think that my advice to any young documentary theatre maker would be, yes, you have to tell the story, but that's a bit like your plot in a normal play. Your play is not your plot. Your play is your theme. Your play is what you're trying to say in those last 10 minutes, when it all comes together. And I suppose the way I've often talked about like what to put in and what to leave out is about what's that central question that can't be answered. And if you haven't got enough kind of dimensions of the crystal on that, then you should go and get another. You should go and get another perspective. I mean, what I will often do is talk to a lot of people in the community, especially the leaders, because you've got to get their imprimatur. But then at some stage, I'll go and seek out a deliberately contradictory position to all those voices that I've got. So you have to always balance what you've found with alternative points of view. And just sort of have a look at what you're repeating. Like for me, have you, in a normal play, a dramaturg would say to you, well, you've established that about the character, we don't need to see it. That's a beautiful scene, but we don't need to see it again. And I would give the same advice to a documentary writer. Don't tell us things that we already know. Show us things that we're not kind of quite sure what we feel about them. There's a moment in Run Rabbit Run where one of the supporters talks about not letting his daughter go to a child's birthday party in a place that was owned by Rupert Murdoch's Fox Studios. And you can see this like little 8-year-old just not understanding, she can't just go to a kid's party. And he's saying, well, these are the choices we make. And it dramatises what I'm trying to talk about, which is you take your politics with your mother's milk, and that whether you rebel against that or it's still kind of inculcated into you. And I think that what you have to do is try and find those situations where the audience are uncomfortable and they don't know what to think. They don't know whether he's right or whether he's wrong. And it's a bit icky. It's kind of like, it's great in a contradictory way. I think that what the mistake documentary makers make is thinking that they have to educate us about the history, and you don't. You really, you have to do the bare bones of that. You know what I mean? But that's not your job as a dramatist. And
it's because I've done some documentary like 1967. There's a clear series of events, but I've also done something that I just talked to a group of people. Like I've done a play about. Well, the estate agents in Hong Kong, because they are so important in Hong Kong, this kind of industry. And I talked to a group, another play. I talked to journalists in Hong Kong about their views on Hong Kong and the media. But for these two plays, I face a question. Then I face a sort of a problem that when I did not have a clear series of events, then it's a bit difficult to, how to put all together these materials. Yes, I talk and it's interesting to hear them talk, but I, as a theater performance, I need to find a structure, a skeleton. Yeah. But when I do not have an event, for example, like One Rabbit Run, maybe, yes, it's still there's still a skeleton for you to hold on to. That's but right. Yes, but for example, like Ladies' Day, I want to ask: is it when you go in? Is it when you go in to talk to the gay people in Broome? Yeah. Do you have a skeleton in your mind already, or it slowly emerges?
Well, this was like Ladies' Day was a play where I used I felt that verbatim was a sufficiently established form that I wanted to actually interrogate it on stage. So there's a character in the play that is a playwright. And so I used I love what you were just talking about, because people don't realise that, sometimes you have a found narrative, which is what Run Rabbit Run was. There's the court cases that mark it. But then other plays, you have to find a structure. And with Parramatta Girls, like I said, it was that they were meeting out at the home, and they were basically getting together and talk. So it's a very simple structure. But in that way, I can then flash back through time. So, it kind of takes in that it's like on a day. And with Ladies' Day, it was the same. I felt, because I wanted to write about, people think that verbatim characters, because they speak, that we should believe what they say. No other dramatic character do we do that. We don't actually believe what characters say. We know what's in the subtext of what they're saying. So I wanted to write a play about, well, what happens if you have a character who wants to tell you something, but they lie, as it were, about it. What would be the reason for them doing that? And so this is a play about sexual abuse within gay relationships and rape, in which a young man talks about an assault that happens in Broome at the races. But actually, we find out much later at the end of the play, well, I don't want to give it too much away, but we find out that there's a different story and there's a reason why he's shamefully made this story about abuse this kind of much more colourful big thing. Because what I wanted to ask questions about is abuse that happens to us that we think, oh, it wasn't that bad, it was really only something little. What was interesting to me was that this got a huge, an audience for the gay community, but lots of young people came to this play. And young women wrote to me and said, you know, I had this thing happen to me and I've never talked about it with anybody because I just sort of thought, oh well, it's not a big dramatic thing. It wasn't that bad. And they were kind of like, the play was actually looking at why we do that to ourselves. So I actually inserted a character in that was the playwright, and she has to make a decision about whether to keep what is verbatim, as it were, from him, but it's not true, you know. And when do you do that? At what point do you have an ethical dilemma? And then there's a moment in the play where the character herself talks about some abuse that's happened to her, that she, you know, and she reveals that. So it was a strategy. You know, you asked me before about how I think verbatim's changed. I think that as playwrights, we have to keep pulling a rabbit out of a hat. The thing, an audience comes in and they go, oh yeah, I know this. I know what's going to happen here. And what you as a playwright have to keep doing is surprising them. And I think that documentary theatre has to keep evolving. You know, I think that when it started, it has all these abilities to bring authenticity and bring us into the now. But I think that now that audiences are inured to that and they know what to expect from that, I think that we have to keep evolving the form and introducing songs or introducing, you know, archive materials or having a character who is an unreliable narrator in this. I mean, you know, what does it do to a verbatim play, which is the most authentic form in some ways, to have an unreliable narrator? So, you know, I just think that you need to, I like the idea that, because verbatim is now so ubiquitous, it's used in dance, it's used in so many forms. So I think that as playwrights, we have to keep freshening the form.
Yeah. So there's another trend, for example, is more into Europe or Germany, that they use real people on stage. So what do you think about? You've also done that.
Yeah, I did that. I did a fantastic. I thought it was a fantastic. It was with a Redfern Community Centre, and again, it was about. I always seem to have these quite dark projects. It was about child sexual abuse. I was working, and I typed up the transcripts, and then I asked, when the audience arrived, they were asked to stand up and read from the transcripts themselves. So they weren't even prepared, perform before. And what happened was, you didn't know in the audience who was an abuse survivor, who was a friend of the family or a parent, and in some ways that was a fantastic metaphor for how we don't know who's had the experience, and we can't know how it affects the family members, you know. And it was a really amazing. I'm sure you've been in plays where, you know, for some reason the performer can't go on that night and someone else goes on and reads, and the audience are like willing them to do well. That's what happened with this. So I did also a play down in Goulburn about prisoners parenting from jail. So men and women, men it was mainly, who were in jail, who had children, and about the children and how the children keep their father's incarceration completely secret. No one can know. But the parent, whether he's done wrong or not, he's still trying to be a parent, you know. And that was performed by quite a lot of community performers, like there were Aboriginal performers, and it goes back to what I said before, which is that I think you structure the play, you write the play in a different way when you're working with non-professional actors, but you can make them be just as, you know, riveting. It's something the writer has to think about. That's my theory. Yeah. Mm.
So,
So I read from your book that you said that sometimes when you interview those with child abuse or with those sexual abuse, the people they just had difficulty to say the words. Yeah. So what's your strategies in getting so much information from down?
Well, I personally think that that's what a verbatim playwright does. See, one of the things I think we do is that we include all the cul-de-sacs and all the obfuscations and all the kind of things that people say before they're about to tell you something really important, whereas some playwrights would just go straight. I've had that experience with actors where actors will say to me, why don't we just cut straight to when they say that. I said, no, the whole point is that they say, like I did it the other day, I had a reading of a play of mine called Wayside Bride, and a woman was remembering she was married to a bigamist, and she found out he was a bigamist, and he left, and then he crawled back in the window and he took a knife out of the drawer, and she said, I don't think he was going, I wouldn't think he would have, like, I know he got it out of the drawer, but I wouldn't think he would, I just honestly don't think he would, and she just couldn't say it, couldn't say it. She kept going, and right at the end she finally said, no, I don't think he was going to kill me, like that. And and you watched her in the moment of kind of contemplating that he was going to do that. And you've got to include all of those to get to, you can't just say, I wouldn't have thought he was going to kill me, because that's not interesting to us. To us as documentary playwrights, it's really interesting why people take so long to say something, and how if they really want to tell you some big thing like child sexual abuse, they will often take you to the point and nod like that, and you'll say, and that was, and they'll go, yeah, that was when. And it's just incredible, because the opposite, a verbatim playwright, sometimes you think you've got to wait for them to say it, but often in those really critical moments, they want you to say it. And so when you put it on stage, you won't have them say it at all. You'll get the audience to go, you'll take them to the point, and then they'll go, yeah, and that's as effective. That's as effective, isn't it? I love that about documentary, that we don't have people say things. In fact, we look at the difficulty with which they don't say things. I think that's what documentary theatre is all about. It's about what people don't say. And it's so heartbreaking to me that people think verbatim theatre is people just stand on a stage and they tell you their story. It's like, they so don't. We don't do that. We actually show you how they don't tell us the deepest, most beautiful thing that's inside them, because they can't sometimes, And look, it's a very misunderstood form, and that I resent that sometimes, but I think it's really great, as you say, to meet another person who's trying to work in that form. So.
We do all the audio transcriptions, and I always mark that so they all find the right words to say, and I all mark down this hesitation pause, and I think this is the most interesting point.
It is, and I did a play called Dead Man Break, which is about a train crash, the waterfall train crash. It's not published, but in it I interviewed some of the paramedics who were at the scene, and they would always say, look, with respect, I won't talk about this, but then they would go on and actually talk about it. And one of the critics came and said, respect is not something you can ever deal with in storytelling, because they should. And I was like, you've believed what they've said. They said with respect they wouldn't say something, but that's not what actually happened. They used that word, with respect I won't say anything, as a kind of flag to say, I know this is sensitive to the relatives and whatever, but then they actually went on to tell you what they saw. So sometimes people use terms of phrase to do the opposite of what they're actually about to do, and I'm sure you would have seen that in a lot of your people will say, oh no, well I wouldn't condemn them for that, and then I'll go on and say something really.
Yes. And I want to ask if, sort of last question, because I'm not familiar with the situation in Australian theatre. Do you think verbatim theatre, documentary theatre, is it a trend in Australia right now, or is start 10 years ago and after the millennium? Yeah. Has it been a trend in Australia?
That's a very good question. I think that verbatim in Australia has there's a growing respect for it. I still think it's actually a bit of a misunderstood form. I think that it's a changing form, like I said, that people are using different strategies. I think that sometimes people can put writers in boxes because they don't know really how to understand or critique their work. I think that verbatim playwrights sometimes suffer from that, like that they will be sort of said, oh, that's a verbatim playwright. And it's kind of like, well, you don't say, that's a... there's problems around categorisation. I think it's the same for actors or whatever. But look, the answer is I think that there's plenty of good verbatim happening in Australia. I think that for me personally, there'd have to be a really good reason for me to... there'd have to be a really good reason for me to think about using pure transcript anymore. I'm not as interested in that, except in, as I say, I keep coming across that in different ways that I have to use it. But yeah, I always still think it's the same for me, that juggling act of why are you using pure transcript? Like, what can't you do in any other way than use this? But you're more likely to get an overview from Paul, or if you've asked that question to other people. I think that certainly for myself, I like to be seen as a playwright, and I will choose whatever dramatic tool is useful to tell the story in the best way. And it just so happens that it usually involves some form of verbatim or documentary theatre practice. But yeah, I don't feel the need to be a purist about that. Okay.
Yes, was there a sort of cultural background to the emergence or the resurgence of documentary theatre or verbatim theatre
in Australia?
In Australia,
again, I can only speak from my own practice. I feel like that it was a way, like I say, in the early 90s, it sort of had a resurgence around the world, didn't it?
Yes.
And I think that was theatre makers globally trying to remind people that theatre can have teeth, as well as be entertaining and diverting. I think it was a cry against decadence. And I think it was a kind of a howl of authentic relevance we wanted. And I think that's what's interesting now, when do we need to negotiate that? How do we still need to, I personally think there's still so many things in Australian history that could benefit from a verbatim or a documentary treatment. I certainly know there's a lot of stories of shame and pain that we need to examine. And I also think that it's a human right for Australians of many different kinds to have their story on stage. One of the things that my lecture was about how I think it's wrong to I think that nowhere in the world can you sustain the kind of monocultural class that's used to going to the theatre. I think that we have to start mixing that up. Because basically it's all hands to the wheel as far as I feel like the future. We need that diversity in our theatres, and as more people of diverse cultural backgrounds start to make direct, write and act in plays, they will bring in a different audience and they will tell different stories, and they will they will tell stories that I don't know the history of, and or that I know vaguely. Like, when we've had Vietnamese people come to Australia, some of those stories are incredibly exciting. The Vietnam War, there's just so many things that I feel that we've had a monocultural view of, and it'd be great to see them from different points of view. So yeah.
That's what I recognize. It's the first time I'm in Australia, and when I especially when I came to Melbourne and Sydney, I realized, well, there are so many Asians here.
Oh yeah.
And the racial was even is
more Asians than
and I think, but it seems that the theater, at least from what I found in Google in the web, it seems to me mainly mainly white issues. It means so.
I think that's what people are it's just starting to change. I mean, like you say, the Chinese have been in Australia right from the beginning, and it's a myth to think that it was just a British colony. Do you know what I mean? The Chinese were here really early, really, really early. They were part of the first, and it's just ridiculous how exclusive theatre has been, and there's been a big change. And I actually think that documentary theatre is a great way to mix that up, because it brings in the audience, it puts those voices on stage. It interrogates a hierarchy in theatre, which is, for me, not interesting anymore. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in working in an ensemble way and empowering the actors to have as much of a felicity to the story as I do. Like, I often will come in and say, well, we're custodians of this for these people. And it's not about me, Alana. It's not about the director. I mean, I'm an artist, so I have a vision for how I want it to go. But we're all working for the community, in a sense. And so I think that